The air was thick with the smell of iron and smoke. Beneath the grey sky of London, a man was dragged across splintering boards, his limbs already bruised from the merciless journey through the streets. His name was William de Marisco, once a nobleman, once a figure of power and wealth. Now, he was nothing more than a body alive, yes, but condemned to serve as a canvas for the crown's darkest warning. Shackled, trembling, yet conscious, he was forced onto the scaffold. The crowd pressed in thousands of eyes fixed on the spectacle. Children hoisted onto shoulders stared wide-eyed, their faces pale with both awe and terror. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Mothers clutched their cloaks tighter against the cold, and soldiers formed a wall of steel around the stage. Everyone waited for the moment they had been promised the dismemberment of a traitor, not in whispers, not in secret, but here, in front of them all. The executioner's tools gleamed freshly honed, each blade catching the thin, reluctant light that pierced through the clouds. There was the rope stiff and stained from use. There was the axe, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. And there were smaller instruments, knives designed not for killing swiftly, but for prolonging suffering. They began with the hanging. The rope tightened around William's neck, lifting his body high until his limbs jerked violently. He kicked, he gasped. His face purpled under the strain. Yet death was denied him. The rope slackened and he collapsed to the boards, coughing and choking, clawing for breath. He had not been executed. He had been prepared. His punishment was only beginning. The knife entered his flesh before he could even catch his breath. The first cut opened him, the crowd groaning as his cries echoed against the stone walls of the city. His own body betrayed him, writhing uncontrollably as if trying to escape the torment. But there was no escape. Every sound he made was a testament to the king's power. Every ounce of pain was a warning. And then came the axe. The executioner, steady and unhurried, raised it high and brought it down not to kill but to sever. Bone, cracked sinew tore, and the air filled with the sickening sound of life being torn apart piece by piece. His limbs, still twitching, were lifted one by one, displayed like trophies to the jeering masses. This was no execution. This was dismemberment alive. And in the final moments, as William's eyes dimmed, but never closed, one question seemed to linger in the minds of all who watched. How had it come to this? How had a man, born into privilege, a man with noble blood, and a seat near the king descended into such ruin, that his death would become one of the most grotesque spectacles England had ever witnessed? Stay. Stay, and you will learn the path that led him here. Before the blood, before the screaming crowds, there was another William de Marisco, a man who did not crawl chained and broken, but who walked in the halls of kings. His early world was one of light and splendor, a life gilded by birthright, yet shadowed by the unspoken fragility of royal favor. England under Henry III was a kingdom of contrasts. The land itself was harsh and unforgiving. Windswept moors seas that swallowed ships whole, but within the walls of noble estates, life was steeped in pageantry. Feasts lit by candlelight stretched long into the night, where silver goblets brimmed with wine roasted boar dripped fat onto golden plates, and minstrels strummed melodies that seemed to silence the troubles of the realm. William was no mere guest at these tables. He was part of this world. His family, the de Mariscos, claimed descent from the powerful de Marisco line of Lundy Island, an outcrop fortress in the Bristol Channel, a rock that gave them both wealth and infamy. To walk the corridors of Henry's court was to be both admired and scrutinized. Nobles glittered in silk and embroidered cloaks, their words as sharp as daggers, hidden beneath their sleeves. Allegiances shifted like sand, and behind every toast lay suspicion. Yet for William, the gilded cage of nobility seemed at first like security. He bore titles. He had access to the king. He moved with the confidence of a man who belonged. But this world of silk and gold was a cage nonetheless. For nobles lived not as free men, but as creatures bound by the crown's will. Henry III was known for his paranoia, his endless fear of betrayal. To be near him was to bask in sunlight and risk burning under its heat. Those who pleased him were raised high, showered with land and honours. But those who faltered, or even appeared to falter, were cast into ruin. William, restless and ambitious, learned this truth far too late. Still, there were moments when life seemed almost invincible. Picture him at a hunt, falcons, wheeling overhead hounds, barking nobles, laughing as they thundered across fields in pursuit of deer. William's laughter would have rung out among them, his hand steady on the reins of his horse, his cloak snapping in the wind. To those watching, he was no different than the rest, a man of blood, of privilege, of destiny. And yet, even in this golden life, the first shadows had already begun to gather. His family's name was whispered with distrust. Pirates and rebels found shelter on Lundy Island, and William's ties to that rocky fortress marked him with suspicion. In the glittering halls of the king, such whispers were poison. So while William dined on roasted meats and raised his goblet in the king's hall, the cage around him was already tightening. The court, with all its music and laughter, was not a sanctuary. It was a stage where every smile could hide a blade and every cheer could turn to condemnation. This was the heaven before the fall, and when it collapsed, the descent would be swift, merciless, and soaked in blood. The seeds of William's destruction were not sown in a single day. They crept in slowly like ivy on stone, spreading in whispers and dark glances, until they strangled his place in the gilded world of nobility. The first crack appeared in his family's name. The de Mariscos were infamous for Lundy Island, that wind-lashed fortress of cliffs rising out of the Bristol Channel. To the crown, Lundy was both a jewel and a threat, a bastion from which pirates could raid passing ships, rebels could be sheltered, and enemies of the king could find refuge. William's kin had long been accused of harbouring such outlaws. And though William himself was noble-born, the stain of piracy clung to him like smoke. Then came the rumours. Treason, it was said, had brushed his family more than once. His uncle Reginald de Marisco had been implicated in a plot against the crown years earlier, and whispers of betrayal never entirely died. For men like Henry III, whose throne rested on perpetual fear of rebellion bloodlines, were not absolution, they were suspicion. And William, proud and reckless, did not shrink from these whispers. He leaned into them. On the seas, William became more than a nobleman, he became a raider. Tales spread of his ships cutting across the channel, striking merchants, seizing cargo. Some said he acted with permission, others that he defied the crown outright. But in an England where loyalty was demanded above all, even the appearance of defiance was poison. He was no longer just William de Marisco, courtier. He was William the outlaw, a man who carved his own laws on the waves. The court began to change around him. Once friendly faces grew cold courtiers who had toasted him, now avoided his gaze. Perhaps they knew what William refused to see, that Henry's suspicion had begun to fix upon him. The king was a man who feared betrayal like plague, and to him, William was becoming a symbol of disobedience too dangerous to ignore. And then came the darkest whisper of all, that William had conspired to assassinate the king himself. The story told of hired men, blades, hidden plans whispered in shadow. Whether it was true or the invention of rivals mattered little. In Henry's mind, rumour was as deadly as proof. Once accused of treachery, a man's fate was no longer in his own hands. For William, the seeds of doom had sprouted into something unstoppable. Each act of defiance, each whisper of rebellion tightened the snare around him. He might have still feasted in noble halls, still worn fine cloaks, and spoken with pride, but the future had already shifted. His every step now led not toward the banquet table, but toward the scaffold. It was only a matter of time before the trap closed, and when it did, there would be no escape. The moment of betrayal came not with the clang of swords, but with the quiet inevitability of fate. William de Marisco, outlaw and nobleman, had lived too long under the crown's gaze. His enemies waited only for the right time to strike, and when it came, they wasted no mercy. It began on the sea, where William felt strongest. From Lundy Island, his family's stronghold, he had commanded raids harboured fugitives and dared to challenge the king's peace. But the sea that once shielded him betrayed him now. His ships, battered by pursuit and storm, could no longer protect him. Soldiers came not as guests, but as hunters descending on Lundy with steel and fire. There was no ceremony, no negotiation. His household was seized, his allies scattered, and William himself was dragged in chains from the fortress that had once been his kingdom. Imagine him then, stripped of armour wrists, bound, forced to his knees before the officers of the king. He would have seen in their eyes the gleam of triumph, the satisfaction of men who knew they were carrying a prize too valuable to lose. For this was not the arrest of a petty outlaw. This was the capture of a traitor, whose punishment would serve as a warning to all of England. They took him first across the waters, his body jolting with each wave as soldiers guarded him with hands on their hilts. The sea, once his ally, mocked him, now carrying him not to freedom, but to London, to the very seat of the king's judgment. There was no dignity in the journey. Crowds gathered at every port, murmuring as the nobleman was hauled ashore like a criminal. His name, once spoken in feasting halls, was spat out with curses. And then the Tower. That fortress of stone, cold and unyielding, swallowed him whole. Its gates clanged shut behind him, their iron jaws sealing his fate. Few who entered those walls ever walked out free. For William, it was the point of no return. The king had been waiting for this moment. To Henry III, William was not just a man, but a symbol, a warning to every noble who might dream of rebellion. Treason was the deadliest of crimes, and William's bloodline, his piracy, his rumoured plots made him the perfect scapegoat. The trial had not yet begun, but in truth it was already over. His capture had set the stage for a punishment that would not only kill him, but destroy him in every possible way. The trap had been sprung. There was no going back to feasts and hunts, no chance to wash his name clean. William de Marisco, once heir to privilege, was now a man marked for slaughter. The crown would make him not only an example, but a spectacle, his body torn apart, to remind all who watched that no one, no matter their blood, could defy the king and live. The descent had begun, and it would lead only to darkness. The Tower of London was not merely a prison, it was a graveyard of hope, a place where walls whispered of despair and where time itself seemed to stretch into eternity. For William de Marisco, dragged through its gates and thrust into its cold belly, it became the stage of his psychological undoing. The cell was small, its air damp with the smell of mildew and rot. Stone walls closed in on him, oozing with the sweat of centuries. The straw on the floor was wet and crawling with vermin, and the single slit of a window offered neither light nor relief, only a cruel reminder that freedom lay somewhere beyond reach, just outside, forever denied. In that darkness, William began to feel his own body betray him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst parched his throat, and sleep came only in shallow bursts, broken by nightmares of the axe and the rope. But worse than the hunger, worse than the filth, was the silence. A silence broken only by distant screams, others being dragged to torture, others confessing crimes they may or may not have committed. Each sound was a prophecy of his own fate. He knew that the Tower was no place of mercy. It was a waiting room for death. And William waited. The king's men came often cloaked in authority, their questions sharp as knives. They demanded names, conspirators, allies. Did he plot against the king? Did he conspire to assassinate him? William denied, or perhaps deflected. But what use were words against men who had already judged him guilty? Every denial only deepened his torment, for he knew their ears were deaf. They did not come to hear his truth, they came to hear his surrender. In the solitude of the tower, William must have replayed his past again and again. He would have remembered the feasts, the hunts, the laughter of nobles who once clasped his hand in friendship. Where were they now, silent, distant? Not a single voice rose in his defense. Friends melted away, allies turned cold, and even family bonds had withered under the crown's pressure. Betrayal had encircled him. He was utterly alone. There were nights when he pressed his back to the wall, listening to the tower's stones breathe with the weight of centuries. The darkness seemed to press into his skull, filling him with visions of the scaffold. He could almost hear the crowd chanting, smell the smoke of torches, feel the rope tighten around his throat. The mind, when trapped, is its own executioner. Time blurred. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Each dawn was a cruel gift prolonging the torment of anticipation. For William, the true punishment was not yet the blade. It was the waiting, the suffocating certainty that death was coming and that it would not be swift. The tower had broken many before him. It would break him too, not with iron chains, but with silence, hunger, and the unbearable weight of inevitability. William was already half dead before the trial even began. The day of judgment arrived not with fairness, but with theatre. In England, treason was the blackest of sins, and William de Marisco, already caged, already broken by the tower's silence, was to be paraded before the court, not as a man to be tried, but as a verdict waiting to be announced. The hall where the proceedings unfolded was heavy with ritual. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of nobles and clerics, all cloaked in solemnity, their faces grave as though they bore witness to justice itself. But beneath that mask lay the truth. The outcome had already been decided. The trial was not meant to determine guilt. It was meant to sanctify the king's vengeance. The charges rang out like a litany of doom. Piracy, harbouring outlaws, conspiracy against the crown, and above all treason, an alleged plot to assassinate Henry III himself. The words echoed, poisoning the air, and each one drove William further from any hope of redemption. He might have spoken in his own defence, might have pleaded that these accusations were born of envy and rumour, but his voice was drowned by the sheer weight of authority arrayed against him. Witnesses appeared, their testimonies delivered with a rehearsed certainty. Some claimed to have seen him consort with rebels. Others swore they heard whispers of a dagger meant for the king's heart. The evidence was flimsy, the accounts riddled with contradictions, yet none of it mattered. To question their words was to question the crown itself, and in Henry's England no man survived such insolence. As William stood bound before his judges, he must have seen the hypocrisy laid bare. Here was a court robed in sanctity, invoking God and law while twisting both into weapons of tyranny. It was not justice, it was spectacle. A carefully crafted display meant to reassure the nobles that loyalty was rewarded and betrayal annihilated, even if the betrayal was only imagined. The sentence was pronounced with cold clarity. William de Marisco was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The most brutal punishment reserved for traitors, a ritual designed not merely to kill, but to erase. His body would be torn apart, scattered, his name reduced to a warning etched in gore. In that moment, whatever dignity remained to him must have crumbled. Yet perhaps in the silence that followed, he allowed himself one final thought, not of justice. For there was none but of irony. That a nobleman once welcomed into the king's halls was now condemned as the vilest of traitors, his fate sealed by lies too convenient to be doubted. The hall emptied, the sentence echoing long after the crowd dispersed. For William, the trial had not been a search for truth. It had been a funeral procession in disguise. His coffin was already waiting, only it would not be a coffin of wood and earth, but of ropes, knives, and fire. The crown had spoken, and now the machinery of death would move swiftly. The night before his death was heavy thick with the kind of silence that presses on the chest like a weight. William de Marisco lay on the cold stones of his cell, aware that with each passing hour the world was closing its doors to him. Time had always been his enemy inside the tower, but tonight it mocked him with clarity. There would be no tomorrow, no reprieve, no miracle of pardon. Only the scaffold, the rope, and the blade. His final meal was meagre. Hardly a king's feast, yet it carried a cruel poetry. A crust of bread, a cup of watered wine, perhaps a strip of salted meat. It was not sustenance, but ritual, a hollow gesture meant to remind him that he still lived if only for one more sunrise. As he chewed, perhaps he thought of the banquets of his youth. Golden platters of roasted boar tables that groaned under the weight of fruit and sweetmeats, goblets filled with claret that seemed to flow endlessly. That world was gone now, its warmth replaced by the bitter tang of fear. Some say a man's last night brings clarity. For William, clarity would have meant pain. He had once been courted by power embraced by nobles feared on the seas. Now he was abandoned, a name cursed, from London to Lundy. Did he think of those who betrayed him, who whispered lies that sealed his doom? Did he curse their names, or did he sit in weary silence, his anger drowned by despair? Perhaps his thoughts turned to family kin who might have still lived, though none would dare come to his aid. Or to Lundy Island, that fortress rising out of the sea, where the gulls cried above the waves, and the wind cut sharp as knives across the cliffs. He would never see it again. The island had been his kingdom, his inheritance. Now, it was a memory slipping from his grasp, dissolving like breath into the night. The priest came as they always did, lantern in hand, Bible in the other, his voice soft, as he urged William to confess, to repent, to cleanse his soul before meeting God. Did William comply? Did he whisper prayers, ask forgiveness for sins, both real and imagined? Or did he meet the priest's gaze with silence, his pride unbroken even on the edge of death? We cannot know. But in that dim light, one truth must have struck him with brutal force. Tomorrow, he would no longer be a man. Tomorrow, he would be a message carved into flesh for all of England to see. And then, at last, the dawn broke. Pale light filtered through the slit in the stone wall, painting his cell in grey. This was his final sunrise, the last he would ever know. He must have stared at it, knowing that when the sun rose again, it would rise on a world that had already forgotten him. The guards arrived, their boots heavy on the stones, their keys clanging against iron. The door groaned open, and William de Marisco, outlaw noble traitor prisoner, was led into the light for the last time. The morning of William de Marisco's execution dawned not with peace, but with anticipation. The city stirred like a restless beast, its people surging into the streets, drawn by the promise of blood. They came from every corner, merchants leaving their stalls, beggars dragging their rags, noblemen cloaked against the chill. All pressed toward the site of the execution, eager to see what had been promised, the full ritual of treason's punishment, the spectacle of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Dragged from the tower, William's body was tied to a wooden hurdle. Horses strained, pulling him through the cobbled streets. His skin scraped raw against the boards, his hair matted with dirt and sweat. The crowd jeered as he passed, some spitting, some hurling stones, while others watched in silence, their faces pale. It was not simply an execution. It was theatre, a performance staged by the crown to sear obedience into the souls of all who watched. At last he was hauled to the scaffold. Torches flickered in the cold daylight, their smoke curling into the air. The executioner stood waiting, his tools laid out in grim order, the rope, the knife, the axe, each gleaming with a cruel purpose. A priest murmured final prayers, but the crowd's roar drowned out his words. William was lifted, forced to the gallows, and the rope slid around his neck. The drop came. His body convulsed, legs, thrashing eyes bulging as the noose bit into his throat. But this was not death. It was cruelty measured in stages. The rope did not kill it. Weakened, tortured, dragged him to the edge of darkness without letting him fall. When the executioner cut him down, he collapsed onto the scaffold, choking, gasping, the blood in his veins still burning with life. Then came the knife. The executioner's hand was steady as he plunged it into William's abdomen, slicing him open before the crowd. The air filled with a metallic stench, the cries of the condemned mingling with the gasps and shouts of those who watched. His organs were pulled from his body, lifted high as tokens of betrayal. William writhed, his voice broken into guttural sounds, but still alive, still conscious of every unspeakable moment. And then the axe. One by one his limbs were hacked away. The sound of steel cracking bone was unmistakable, echoing across the square. Each stroke was followed by a grotesque display, an arm held aloft, a leg dragged across the boards, reminders to the crowd that treason was not simply punished but annihilated. William's body convulsed, twitching, even as pieces of him were severed, his life torn from him, inch by inch. At last, his head was taken. With a final swing, it was separated from his body, lifted high for all to see. Blood sprayed across the scaffold, staining the wood, dark dripping onto the earth below. The roar of the crowd rose to its peak, a mixture of triumph, horror, and something darker, a fascination with the spectacle of cruelty. William de Marisco was no more. But his death was not his own. It belonged to the king, to the crown, to the message carved into his broken body. Betray, and this will be your fate. When the axe fell silent, so too did the crowd. The roar that had thundered moments before ebbed into a strange, uneasy hush. All that remained on the scaffold was the ruin of a man, William de Marisco, reduced to fragments scattered across blood-soaked boards. His body, once whole, once clothed in the dignity of noble birth, was now a collection of trophies awaiting their grim journey across the realm. The executioner, his hands slick with blood, moved with a practiced detachment. One by one, William's limbs were wrapped and marked, destined for different corners of England. Each quarter would hang in a public place nailed high where every passerby could see. They would blacken with time, flesh, rotting bones, bleaching in the wind, silent warnings that would outlast memory. His head, severed and raised high to the crowd, was destined for London Bridge. There it would stare down at the Thames, eyes hollow mouth, slack, an eternal guardian of fear. The people shifted uneasily. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves, while a few slipped away quickly as though eager to rid themselves of what they had seen. Yet many remained rooted, staring, as though unable to look away. For they knew they had witnessed not just a death, but a statement, a brutal sermon preached in flesh and bone. And yet, after the spectacle came the void. The cheers, the jeers, the fascination, they drained into silence as the scaffold was cleared. The blood pooled darkly, soaking into the earth, as though the ground itself sought to swallow the memory. The smell lingered acrid and metallic, clinging to clothes, to hair, to lungs. The silence pressed heavy, as though London itself held its breath. For the crown, there was no silence, only triumph. Messengers rode out, bearing William's quarters to castles, to cities, to villages where rebellion might stir. Each piece was a message more eloquent than any decree. This is what becomes of traitors. The king's will was carved into William's flesh, spread across the realm in gruesome fragments. His death did not end with him. It continued echoing with every gasp of those who passed beneath his remains. But for William, silence was all that remained. No more hunger, no more fear, no more torment in the tower's darkness. His agony was extinguished, but so too was his voice. Whatever truth he carried, whether guilt or innocence was buried with him, smothered by the crown's narrative. The silence was not peace, it was erasure. And so the city settled back into its rhythm. Merchants reopened their stalls. Children played in alleys, their laughter returning to streets still stained with blood. The scaffold was washed, the pieces carried away, and London moved forward as though nothing had happened. But beneath it all lingered the memory of screams, the vision of a body torn apart while still alive. The silence that followed was not absence, it was presence, a haunting reminder that cruelty once unleashed leaves echoes long after the last cry has faded. History rarely remembers William de Marisco as a man. It remembers him as a warning, his rebellion, his piracy, his defiance of the crown. These details blur with time, twisted by rumour and royal decree. What remains sharp is his death, the spectacle of cruelty that turned a nobleman into a cautionary tale. For Henry III, the execution achieved its purpose. By tearing William apart, the king stitched fear into the fabric of his realm. Nobles who might have dreamt of rebellion thought twice, imagining their own bodies quartered, their heads spiked above London Bridge. The crown had made an example of William, and examples were worth more than battles. It was theatre won as powerful as any army, yet the irony lies in legacy. William's crimes, whether exaggerated or real, are not what echo most loudly across the centuries. Few recall the intricacies of his alleged plots or the specifics of his piracy. What endures is the horror of his punishment, the grotesque spectacle of a man dismembered alive. In seeking to erase him, the crown immortalized him. His agony became history's ink, and every retelling deepens the scar he left on England's memory. Consider the cruelty of the ritual itself, hanged but not killed, drawn but still breathing, quartered while his heart beat on. This was not justice, it was theatre of domination. A sovereign's performance to remind all who watched that loyalty was not a choice, it was survival. Such executions were as much psychological warfare as they were punishments, planting terror deep into the hearts of the living. But what does this reveal about us, about humanity's fascination with cruelty dressed as justice? The crowds who gathered that day did not avert their eyes. They leaned in closer. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Apprentices abandoned their work. Nobles looked on with stony silence. Some recoiled in horror, but others cheered. The execution was both nightmare and entertainment, a paradox that still haunts us. Centuries later, William de Marisco's name whispers to us from the blood-soaked pages of history, not as a man to admire, but as a question to confront. Was his death justice, or was it the crown's fear masquerading as law? Was he a traitor or a scapegoat? History gives us no certainty. It gives us only the echo of screams, the silence that followed, and the knowledge that cruelty has often worn the mask of order. And so the tale lingers, not because William lived, but because of how he died. His body was scattered across England, but his story remains whole, a grim reminder of power's hunger and the fragile thread upon which every life in the shadow of kings once hung. Tell me then, was William's death an act of justice, or was it simply the theatre of cruelty that defines the darkest pages of human history?